So let me introduce the next speaker, Professor COLEY. So he is an assistant professor at MIT in the development of chemical engineering and the development of electrical engineering and computer science. His research group at MIT works at the interface of chemistry and data science to develop models that understand how molecules behave, interact, and react, and use that knowledge to engineering new ones with an emphasis on therapeutic discovery. So although I don't have any information about when you got the PhD or etc., but I believe that you are very young rising star in this field, and I'm really happy to listen to your lecture today. Okay, so yeah, Professor Corey, please start.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Professor Barnick, for the opportunity to be here and share a little bit about the work that we're doing at MIT. I couldn't help but slightly revise the title of the summer school, just to Chemoinformatics instead of Chemoinformatics, the nomenclature that we use over there. All right, so I'm going to talk a lot about chemical synthesis and thinking about molecular design in the context of synthesis. This is going to relate back to a lot of the things that we've already heard earlier in this week, especially from Gisbert, but hopefully you'll find things more complementary than redundant. So I want to start off with just the classic sort of virtual screening pipeline and a few snippets from select publications that do virtual screening that ultimately result in some experimental validation. And the reason why I start here is just to point out that currently the workflows that we have for computer-aided molecular design still involve quite a bit of manual selection or filters or heuristics to get us down to that final set of compounds that we truly source or synthesize and ultimately test. And so you see sort of a few of these quotes, they think about many different properties and there's sort of this ambiguous way in which they come together. A lot of filters due to sort of synthesis, the sort of point 4 at the bottom, thinking about all these molecules with ranks ranging from 16 to 246,000 were selected for de novo synthesis and testing. And this is not anything against the experimental results and the accomplishments here, but if you have a computational algorithm that's prioritizing molecules and you're choosing compounds number 246,000, you might think about revising, the way that you're ranking these compounds. So we're going to come back to this sort of DMTA cycle that we've been talking about quite a bit. And in particular, I want to just point out, as Gisbert did, that there's sort of this close relationship between design and synthesis is one that tends to be a little bit overlooked. And so we have the classic cycle and we have them as two separate stages, but really we like to consider them a little bit more intimately coupled together. So we're going to come back to that point, and that's going to be the major theme of this talk. Now, again, I think we're all familiar at this point with the notions of virtual screening, taking some structure property relationship surface or some simulation or some ability to score molecules on the basis of their properties and just query them with a long list. And sometimes that list is very long, sometimes that list is very short if we're doing things like drug repurposing. But of course, the excitement in a lot of the sort of popular literature that you read today is shifting towards generative design, inverse design, de novo design, coming up with novel structures that go beyond these lists, because as we've already discussed, even a list of tens of billions is a drop in the bucket, compared to the vast possibilities of molecular space. And so we also work a bit on these different generative design algorithms. We think about building up different techniques to propose new structures. The very basics of generative design is you typically, not always, but typically in two stages, will first teach a generator what normal molecules look like. You'll show it PubChem, you'll show it Chembl, you'll show it Zinc, and it will learn the distribution of normal looking molecular structures that are maybe bioactive or maybe drug-like in some sense. The generator alone is not usually that important, We don't just care about sampling from PubChem, we care about sampling from the distribution of molecules that have very particular properties. And so we'll couple that, with some evaluator. You can't escape QSAR, You can't escape property prediction. And so we need that sort of in silico feedback loop. And so here, this is an animation just showing a sort of atom by atom method. This is graph invent from AstraZeneca. proposing a molecule that is predicted to optimize some PROTAC scoring function, predicting degradation efficiency. We've also done this design in 3D space. And so this is a shape conditions generative model. So we provide the model with a query shape shown as a blue mesh, and we ask it to generate a new ligand shown here in pink. And you can see, some of the time it gets it sort of close. We, of course, need to compare this to rocks and other shape-based virtual screening. And now we're extending this to colored surfaces using pharmacophore models. But we can also do this sort of design in 3D space. That works fine. The challenge is that when you actually apply these methods to many molecular optimization tasks, you end up with a wide range of structures. And so all these molecules are real structures that are proposed by what are claims to be, or at the time were claims to be, state-of-the-art generative models for molecular design. Things that are wonderful at maximizing C log P or QED, right? These are really toy problems and benchmark tasks that the field tends to focus on, especially the computer science field. And so, of course, you have some molecules that are fairly reasonable, and you have other molecules that are fairly unreasonable. And this is a problem, right? And this is one of the big issues that I hear when I talk to collaborators, right, across the industry and in pharma and chemical companies and agriculture companies, is that they just don't like the proposals coming from generative techniques, often because they have these sort of funny quirks that appear. And these are certainly cherry-picked because they look pretty ridiculous. But this is not unusual, right? That you get molecules proposed by these models that tends to look unstable or, at the very least, unsynthesizable. Now, I know people have used these in the past for other situations, and I think there's a close relationship to these notions of domains of applicability that we've talked about before, right? The reason why these molecules are proposed is not because the generator is horribly confused. It's because the oracle, the scoring model, tells the generator that these are good molecules, right? And so these are, either maximizing heuristic functions or machine learning oracles that don't have any great notion of domain of applicability or uncertainty. And so, to some extent, right, generators are wonderful optimizers, and they find all of the pathologies and the holes and the weird exploits that exist in our scoring functions. Now, another caveat is that these problems really do get most uncovered when we apply generative techniques to optimization. You might be thinking, if you've trained, a SMILES VAE or any sort of generative model that's just doing distribution learning, it can propose molecules that look fine, right? But when you switch them to then optimize some property of interest, that's when you sort of really go off the rails. You're pulling the model away from its prior of reasonable chemical space into these weird edges where it thinks it's doing a good job finding optimal structures. And so we're going to try to sort of mitigate these challenges, in particular focusing on this question of synthesizability. And I think from Gisbert's talk, you already probably know this is leading sort of back to this notion of reaction-based design, but we'll take a circuitous path to get there. This is sort of also exemplified by a lot of these sort of case studies and examples that you find of using generative design in practice. And this was the 2019 in silico paper that got some mixed reception, but was a nice example, at least, of using generative design to propose structures as the start of a long computational funnel. And what I focus on when I think about their pipeline is that, sure, you can justify filters, heuristics, and clustering. Those can be objective to narrow it down to 40 from 30,000. But then from 40, they go down to 6, just by showing chemists 40 structures and deciding which ones can be made. And I find that unsatisfying, right? And so this just sort of emphasizes to me why synthetic tractability is really an essential consideration here. The field has come up with a number of different heuristics and scoring functions for synthetic accessibility. These are often fragment-based methods, sometimes heuristics, sometimes trained on expert chemists' information or frequency of fragments in databases. And so you can imagine taking one of these heuristics, which just maps a structure to a scalar, and using it to bias generation, right? So maybe we're not just trying to optimize predicted binding, we're trying to optimize predicted binding times the synthesizability score. And you can do that, and it tends to work in many cases. But these heuristics, I would argue, are really not doing a very robust job at assessing synthesizability. Just as we have structure activity cliffs, we have structure reactivity cliffs. So there are molecules that are quite similar in structure by many measures. But then if you look at how you have to synthesize them, they can be quite different and quite complex. And so I like pointing out, ribavirin is the one on the left, very easy to make. If you skip a deprotection step, it's just a single substitution reaction. The molecule on the right is not ribavirin, and it's a very sort of steppy process to get there. Maybe I think it's between 5 and 10 steps will probably get you to that structure. But they look fairly similar, and so the heuristics perceive them as fairly similar. A different approach from using these heuristics is just keeping a memory, basically, of what normal molecules look like. And so reInvent does this quite nicely. So reInvent, very nice model that works well out of the box from AstraZeneca. It generates smiley strings and it tries to optimize some scoring function, but it does so without forgetting about the prior. And so in the sort of augmented probability, what it's trying to learn, right, is to generate this series of tokens, capital T, in a way that maximizes the score, but balances the maximization of that score with the likelihood assigned by a prior. Again, trained on PubChem, I think, in this case, maybe Campbell, maybe Zinc. And so basically you want your model to do an optimization, but not to get too far away from that prior of reasonable looking molecular structures. That tends to keep you in a decent space. Now, by far, I would say the most robust approach compared to those sort of heuristics and these penalty functions is just do retrosynthetic analysis, right? If we want to know if a molecule can be synthesized, let's try to answer the question more directly, how are we going to synthesize it? And so for this, the task of synthesis planning arises, right? The task is to take the input compound in the bottom right corner and propose the full series of synthetic steps, all the intermediates, all the viables, ideally all the conditions as well, right? How would we actually make this molecule if we were to go into the lab and ask our chemists to do so, or if we call up our favorite CRO and ask them to do so as well. And so retrosynthetic analysis has been around for a very long time, since the early 1960s. And when we think about retrosynthetic analysis, there's a few sort of core elements that we have to build up. So retrosynthetic programs tend to comprise a one-step method, so a model that can take a product structure and propose a single-step disconnection in a single set of precursor molecules. It needs a method to do that recursively. And so from a target structure, you have many options, and then for each of those, you have to decide which to expand. And so you have this combinatorial explosion, and so you need some tree search algorithm to help you cope with that growth, the number of states. And you need to know when to stop. And so we just use Bible catalogs for that criterion. So again, take the target, we have our options, we have to choose one with some expansion, our selection policy, to then expand further and further back until we happen to stumble upon commercially available starting material, so we can consider ourselves done. This isn't a talk on retrosynthesis, but I do want to point out that the two sort of upper components, right, the one-step model and then the tree search algorithm, are typically treated as entirely distinct, and they're evaluated separately. And there's a lot of benchmarking that's done for the single-step task, and then there's a little bit of benchmarking that's done for the multi-step task, but it is not a straightforward thing to do to measure the performance of these quantitatively. We've already talked about reaction templates. We've already seen some smart strings. We saw one from AI Zinc-Finder. This is just a figure from one of Bartosz Grabowski's papers describing Chematica, which is now Cynthia from Millipore Sigma. And the essence of the program in these template-based methods, right, are these rules encoded as smart strings that are horrible to visualize unless you have helpful graphical interfaces to do so. And this encodes, right, this sort of transformation rule that tells you, when you see a product substructure, how do you transform that into reactant substructures? Chematica in particular, right, really emphasized also recording these incompatible groups to say the conflicts, okay, if this is present, don't propose this type of reaction. Now, this is very tempting to continue this approach because you can eventually build up a very large knowledge base successfully. You can look at these nice little textbooks of named reactions and things work quite well. But instead, we and many others, right, have been trying to learn these kinds of transformation rules from data. Now, reaction data is in some ways abundant, but in some ways not super clean or accessible. a lot of the field focuses on this USPTO data, where it is open source, and so it's quite convenient to use for benchmarking, but it's small and it's based on this information extraction pipeline circa 2014, 2016, and so it has some known limitations, to put it mildly. We use quite a lot this pistachio data set, so I'm really struggling with the pointer here. This pistachio data set, which is commercial, but more accessible, and that's using, again, information extraction pipelines, but applied to patents as well. We also have a relationship with chemical abstracts to use data from SciFinder. And then there's these sort of emerging high throughput data sets from various labs around the world. And we've been trying to consolidate those and more in this open reaction database effort. And again, the curation of these is quite important and does influence the kinds of models we're able to build with them. And so these are the data sets that we use to train models to do retrosynthesis for us. And again, because this isn't a retrosynthesis talk, I'm not going to go into detail about how these methods work and how they perform, but I will mention that one of the things that my lab has helped contribute to is this program that we call ASCOS, which brings together a lot of these different tools for retrosynthesis, reaction prediction, condition recommendation, actually a lot of things that you could have found in the AI-FOSS program many, many years ago, but sort of retrained, reimagines in this sort of data-driven perspective. And I will also mention that, of course, AI's Finder and syntheses from Microsoft are both also nice open source retrosynthesis packages. And then ASCO sort of adds on top of that some extra conditions and forward prediction utility. So tools like ASCOS, right, are useful for planning routes. And actually, ASCOS is one that we used several years ago, an early version, in an experimental demonstration with a robotic flow chemistry platform. So we plugged in ASCOS to this system, and this robot would reconfigure its flow path and start synthesizing some very simple APIs. So this approach number 2, right, would be generate structures, query your retrosynthetic program to figure out, can you make them? How can you make them? But this is also deeply unsatisfying, right? Because this is basically like doing an optimization, finding a solution, and then hoping that solution happens to be within some feasible set. Right? And quite often that's not the case, right? So we do an optimization, we find structures, and then we realize none of them look synthesizable according to our filters. And numerically, if you're doing a constrained optimization, you're not going to do an unconstrained optimization and then check your constraints. You're going to incorporate them into the search. So this is also not a terribly great approach. A third approach is a method that's we were developing accidentally in parallel with Synthesia, thinking about how do you potentially generate these analog spaces when you're constraining yourself to, let's say, a single reaction pathway of choice. So if you don't want to allow yourself to use any type of reaction or any different retrosynthetic pathway, what you can do is you can expand around a single sort of analog given a single synthetic pathway. And so in this sort of example, what we did was we first did this mini virtual screen of just 250,000 molecules through some machine learning oracle. We found the structure from this initial set with the highest score. So this compound's 12. We took compound 12 and we found a synthetic routes to make it. And that synthetic routes, we can take the reaction templates associated and define general patterns to query building block sets. And we can enumerate then several million analogs, right, of this compound 12 that we sort of expect, to follow the same synthetic pathway, but use different building blocks. And then we can plot them in UMAP and just sort of compare, the chemical world of zinc is this blue contour plot. And then the enumerated space, we're showing contour lines in red. And you can see that our analog space is more localized to that seed molecule. And so we're doing this somewhat local expansion. And so again, this is very much akin to what we heard from Matthias about synthesia. And one of the sort of distinctions, though, that I'll emphasize here is that instead of focusing on this use case where we do this analog expansion given a known route, we're also trying to bring that consideration upstream. And by that, I mean we're trying to use the desire for diversifiability to inform route selection in the first place. So chemists don't like to revise their routes in the middle of a campaign. And so what we can do is we can use ASCO, so we can find for this simple molecule, hundreds or thousands of different pathways. For each of those pathways, we can estimate the number of analogs based on this building block enumeration. And we can choose the pathway that will give us the largest number of analogs. And so this has been a useful way of trying to define these large accessible spaces. Now, the fourth approach, and this is the last 4 to 4, that we'll talk about is to go back to this idea of constraints. And yes, this is sort of returning back sort of full circle to earlier reaction-based methods like synopsis, like DOGS, because the idea is that even though we're all very excited about deep generative models that can propose sequences of tokens or graphs or three-dimensional point clouds, it really makes sense to design molecules in terms of their synthetic pathways if we want to guarantee that the molecules are synthetically tractable. And so the sort of reaction-based design is something that has been around for some time. The wave of generative techniques sort of lost sight of synthesizability. Now it's starting to come back around. And so in our own approaches to this task, what we've been doing is training different policy models to construct synthetic pathways basically from the bottom up, right? So select building blocks, select reaction transformations, and compose these different synthetic trees. And so this particular model is a conditional generator. We give it a fingerprint of our target molecule, and we train it to reproduce a synthetic pathway by selecting building blocks and selecting reaction templates that will produce a synthetic pathway that produces that molecule of interest. And so we train this on known molecules, known pathways, and then when we want to apply it to design, we'll sort of take this same space of commercial building blocks and different templates, and we will modify that conditional code. So we'll just change that vector so it's no longer a true fingerprint of a molecule, it's just a numerical vector. That gives us different choices of the policy. So we get a new synthetic pathway, which gives us a different molecule, which gives us different properties. And then this whole thing is sort of wrapped around with a model-free optimization technique, like a genetic algorithm. And so we can apply this to optimization of different objective functions and heuristics, whether they're good property oracles or toy problems. This is a toy problem, this GSK3 beta model. And what we find is that we have an extraordinarily simple solution that emerges from this generative model because it's forced to think about chemical synthesis compared to other atom-based or fragment-based models that don't care about synthesis, they only care about optimizing the score. And so in effect, by forcing our model to think about chemical synthesis, we're not only guaranteeing that we have a recipe, but we're also sort of regularizing the size and the complexity of the structures we get. Okay, now I have a short quiz for the people that know machine learning. So if you have a model that's a policy model, and you want to improve your neural network because a boring, simple neural network isn't doing as well, what kind of architecture do you change to? If your neural network isn't doing quite as well as you want, what's the next thing you'll do? Just replace it with a transformer. So I'm going to skip through this example in the interest of time, and we're going to go straight to the upgraded version. So we had that sort of initial demonstration with a policy generator, and then, of course, transformers are taking over every different architecture. And so we said, well, let's just replace this with a transformer. So it's a similar idea. In this case, it's an encoder-decoder architecture. So we encode with a graph transformer. We decode with a normal sequence generator transformer, which is going to do the same kind of thing, generating these series of building blocks and reaction steps to compose this linearized version of a synthetic pathway. And so we, again, train this on known molecules with known synthetic pathways. We actually generate our own training data sort of on the fly for this. And with this new model, we get a direct upgrade basically on the results from before. So when we encode a molecule and we try to decode a pathway to make it from the bottom up, we almost always get a valid synthetic pathway. 30% of the time we can recover the molecule that we encoded, which isn't perfect. But the fun thing is with this model, instead of looking at this as a 70% failure rate, we can pretend it's a feature, not a bug, and we can say, well, even if you don't make the molecule that you encoded, you make something that's quite similar, right, by different metrics. And so you can encode whatever molecule you want into the graph transformer, And the transformer decoder is going to try to come up with a pathway using the building blocks it has access to, using the templates it has access to. And even if it doesn't find a pathway to the thing you care about, it'll find something that's very close in terms of structural similarity or pharmacophore similarity in these cases. And this actually, this bug turned into a feature tends to hold for other use cases as well. So one of the nice things that we can do with this is do this sort of synthesizable analog generation. And again, in the top corner, sort of Gisbert mentioned doing this with dogs and natural products. And here in this case, what we're doing is we're taking an unconstrained generative model, this Pocket 2 mole, which does a sort of 3D generation inside a protein pocket, if I'm not mistaken. That gives us a structure that is not necessarily synthesizable, and we can round trip that through our model, and we can end up getting synthesizable analogs that work quite well as well. And so these tables are just sort of looking at for different protein targets. We have a reference ligand, we have a generated ligand, and then we pass that generated ligand through our model to turn it into something that is synthetically tractable. And what we find is that we sort of tends to match or sometimes even improve the docking score. Yes, it's a docking score, but from the model's perspective, it's doing its job, trying to optimize these values. So there's a very close relationship between what these models are doing and very familiar concepts of make-on-demand libraries. So the models are given access to commercial building blocks, these expert-defined templates, and we let it go for some undetermined number of reaction steps. And of course, make-on-demand libraries are sort of constructed through similar means, right? All these vast virtual spaces that we've been talking about are also produced by combining building blocks and reaction transformations to enumerate explicitly or implicitly a very large number of structures. And so in this case, the advantages, I would say, of why are we overcomplicating our lives by using a transformer? It's because we're trying to learn how to navigate this space very efficiently. We're not setting a maximum number of steps. We're not doing explicit enumeration, and we're not actually requiring it to be combinatorial. So the notion of doing sort of synthon-based design in a fully combinatorial space is wonderful, and we've talked about some of those methods here, but also there's syntheses, and Pat Walters had this Thompson sampling paper, but that requires you to have a truly combinatorial space where any building block A and any building block B can come together, and you don't consider the nuances of the reactivity conflicts. But with this architecture, you can learn those conflicts and still learn to navigate the space. And again, yes, we know and we'll hear more about these vast chemical spaces. And so these are essentially just avoiding explicit or implicit even enumeration just by teaching the model how to navigate this landscape on its own. Okay, so virtual screening often built up through synthesis. Generative models, we also have to think about synthesis, especially because we have these weird pathological cases. But in the last few minutes, I want to mention a different strategy that tries to view synthesis as less binary, right? Because synthesis is not really just, can we make it or is it impossible to make it? It's a very continuous function, and there's cost associated with it. And so I'm going to talk about this framework that we call Sparrow. And the sort of basis of Sparrow is thinking about experimental design and driving design cycles in these sort of medchem campaigns. Now, increasingly, we're getting molecular ideas from many different sources. Those could be our generative models. They could be constrained by synthesis or not. They could be from catalogs. They could be from experts. They could be from different enumeration techniques. And currently, I would argue it's kind of hard to compare these sort of head-to-head and to really think about them all on a level playing field. Because maybe our experts come up with 5, our generative model comes up with 1 million, and then enamine comes up with 50 billion, and we have to decide what to pick from this large, messy set. And so what Sparrow is trying to do is it's trying to basically take ideas of Bayesian optimization and molecular optimization and virtual screening and combine that with synthesis planning to do cost-aware Bayesian optimization in this special space of molecular design. And so we're going to try to balance the sort of reward that we'll get from picking molecules that have high predicted properties or good predicted properties, and the cost involves in their synthesis, right? Or their cost if we just buy them directly. Now we're going to pose this as an optimization, and because we're trying to make this formal as an optimization, we have to introduce a lot more notation than it makes sense to go through. But we essentially define this vast set of candidate structures, and we pose this linear integer optimization by defining an objective function that's trying to explicitly balance the selection of molecules that have high predicted properties or high rewards. We're trying to not spend that much on catalog compounds or starting materials, and we're trying to choose as few reactions as possible. And if we do have to do our own synthesis, we're trying to make sure that we're picking reactions that have a high likelihood to succeed. Now, these are all predictions. And so the first rewards we can get from, QSAR models, stocking. These basically are the same things you would use if you're doing Bayesian optimization. The costs can come from catalogs. That's the most straightforward. And then the reactions and the pathways and the likelihoods of success are things that we predict with our ASCOS program, trained on reaction data. And so in the Sparrow paper, one of the case studies that we look at comes from this optimization campaign that took place at MIT as part of this big DARPA program to demonstrate the autonomous discovery of new molecular dyes. I'm really trying to focus on near IR dyes. And so this was a robotic platform that was using AI to propose structures, propose synthetic pathways, execute those syntheses, measure properties, and loop back with humans only acting as sort of unskilled operators. And so over the course of several iterations, we're trying to simultaneously optimize the location of the maximum absorption peak, trying to have these be relatively water soluble, as well as photostable. And so you can see these are, the errors are decreasing over time. We've got these sort of nice graphics. We're doing the DMTA cycle. And experimentally, so that would be worth showing. It's a robotic liquid handler that is doing plate-based synthesis. And it's sort of shuttling, this sort of Scara arm shuttles things between a special high temperature reactor, a liquid handler deck, which is just a TCAN, chromatography for analysis and some purification, also just liquid-liquid extractions. And then we have this sort of analysis doing like photodegradation studies, and we do plate-based assays for everything else. So this demonstration was a real use case for autonomous molecular discovery and driving these DMTA cycles. And so at one of the design iterations, after we had used a generative model to propose many different candidates, there were 121 under consideration. And so from Sparrow's perspective, it's seeing this list of 121 possible molecules that it could make. We've already scored them based on those three properties we're trying to optimize for these dye molecules. And what Sparrow is trying to do is it's trying to take these 121 options, which do require synthesis, and decide which subset is optimal. So with a certain set of hyperparameters that we choose, from the 121 candidates, we're going to test 15. And the 15 that we're testing are shown in pink on this slide. And so 6 of them we can just purchase. And so Sparrow's like, you can just buy these, don't bother doing synthesis, right? Simpler to purchase, which makes perfect sense. 9 of them we're going to synthesize. We decided it's worth going through the effort of performing reactions if we can test these 9 additional compounds, which require 6 building blocks and 10 reaction steps between them. Now, don't worry about the actual structures on the slide, but what I want to point out is that this sort of nice clustering on the right-hand side really shows how Sparrow is trying to balance synthetic cost and molecular rewards, because it's identifying opportunities to gain value from intermediate structures explicitly as it makes these sort of final structures that all have different reward values shown with this sort of little R subtitle, and is identifying common synthetic intermediates to access multiple streams we're trying to test. So it really is doing this sort of synthetic network optimization to find the most efficient way to run as few reactions as possible while still getting to test as much as we can and getting as much value as possible through this design cycle. And so this is sort of exemplifies really what Sparrow is about. It's trying to do this synthetic cost-aware optimization. And so this coupling of synthesis planning and candidate down selection, of course, is a theme because we talk about design and synthesis together quite a lot. I guess just to emphasize a little bit of what we hope is coming down the pipeline, there's a lot of complexity in how you consider cost and how you consider rewards, obviously. And so parallel chemistry and automation influence the costs considerably. There's also a lot of questions about how to define rewards, and I'm sure people here have very strong opinions about this. Two very similar molecules, you could say, are redundant, or you could say if they're matched pairs, they answer a very specific question of structure. And so how do we consider the non-additivity and non-linearity of a set of molecules is interesting, and I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts. So with that, I'll just sort of close with this summary. Try to sort of really emphasize this notion of generative design incorporating chemical synthesis. There are several ways that the field has chosen to approach this with heuristics, or with filters, with constraints, either through enumeration or with generative design. But I also think that this idea of treating synthesis more as a continuous cost is one that we in the group are going to advance a little bit further. And really, we're all interested in chemoinformatics here, but if you're also thinking about the bridge to automation and autonomous testing, closed-loop design, thinking carefully about what your experimental platform can access is essential for really bringing these two together. So I'll just thank the group, thank funders, and thank you again for the invitation and your attention.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the great talk and a very extensive and comprehensive development, and it's very impressive. So yeah, I can accept some questions. So please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. What I see from your slides is that the core idea of all of this is no matter how you generate or what you generate, it must be synthetically accessible. So there is nothing to debate about if you generate the compounds for yourself and then you synthesize inside of your lab. But in silico, we generate compounds for the customers, and thus the synthesizability is a question to us, because if we start to think about it, academia more thinks about the synthetic accessibility as about some absolute thing that the compound must be synthesizable somehow, somewhere, by somebody. If you start speaking to industry, they sometimes think about how much might it cost. So if it costs too much, then it's not handleable. And if you talk to CROs, they start to speak about their competencies. And they may say that maybe it is synthesizable, but we have no experience to how to do this, and thus we consider it non-accessible. So how would you define what is synthetic accessibility?
Yeah, so that perception does come from predictive models, right? Our perception comes from predictive models. The original formulation of the objective function for Sparrow is trying to take in these considerations directly, right? So cost is continuous, right? Fewer steps is better than many steps. Each of those steps might have a risk of failure, and that's what the CRO is sort of conveying, is that they're happy to take your money and spend a few months working on this, but maybe you'll get nothing right at the end. And so that's part of what the original formulation, before we did a linear approximation, is doing, is it's trying to say, okay, what is the expected reward? I'm going to spend this many FTE months trying to make a compound. If I make it, it's wonderful. If I fail, I get nothing. And so we're actually in the original formulation trying to balance the expected rewards, taking into consideration those risks of failure against that sort of continuous cost of how much effort will it take. And you can imagine that we could have some score that says, okay, well, ASCOs didn't find a pathway, but let's not say that means it's unsynthesizable. Let's just assume that means we're going to spend more time on this. It has a higher risk of failure. And so maybe there's like a floor that we impose. But there's also something, yeah, there's something that was, you sort of alluded to at the beginning of your question, which is that sort of a lot of times people will design molecules and they won't want to initially think about synthesizability. I would say that I am very skeptical of most computational predictions of molecules and think that if you could choose between something that is clearly synthesizable and something that is likely hard to make, we don't trust our property prediction oracles enough to really justify investing so much effort into that more difficult molecule. I very much buy into this like fast failure, fast iteration mentality. And so that's why I do also prefer being a little bit more conservative in these filters than other people do.
Okay, so this is the last question.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. A great talk. I was just wondering, because most probably you're thinking about it. Imagine during the iterations, you are getting the results, and then obviously those results can improve your models.
Yeah.
So like do some kind of active learning and things.
Yeah.
How do you think in general, all these models that you are taking into account, which of them will be easily tunable and do fine tuning? And how can we take that into account? Like,
Yeah.
You get four points and then you improve synthesizability or whatever, or affinity prediction or something.
So we only have ever done fine tuning on the property prediction models. We've never really done fine tuning on the synthesis models themselves. I think I don't have a great idea of how to do that. Yeah, we can talk more about that.
Okay, so I suppose there are also many questions, but the time is up. And yeah, so let's thank the two morning session speakers again.